Good morning, everybody. I think we probably are ready to start. We're here to talk about a very important topic, of course, and this is informality and the challenges that informality poses to the promotion of decent work and social justice. We all know that we're in this region, as elsewhere, but in this region we're talking about today, there's very high rates of informality. Typically, overall, on average, about 2/3 of people are in some form or other working informally in the economy. Generally speaking, those economies in South Asia have particularly large informal economies, but virtually all economies have an informality to one degree or another. And here in Thailand, as many of you know, despite its high level of development and being upper middle income, there is a very large informal economy in this country as well. Informality necessarily goes against social justice and decent work. The basic mandate for the organization that I work for, the International Labour Organization. But the world of work, informality tends to be associated with the absence or the weakness of rights at the workplace, with often generally poor working conditions. And of course, people in the informal economy tend to have poor, if any, access to social protection provisions, etc. Generally speaking, with the challenges posed to economies around the region during the COVID times, I think we have seen evidence of increasing informality at the workplace, and particular challenges perhaps faced by informal workers, who by definition are often the most vulnerable in the workforce. So today we're going to look at how to combat informality and spur formalization, particularly focused on employment and looking at the overall objective of trying to achieve social justice and decent work at the workplace. So it's a big topic. We've put together some questions. There'll be 2 rounds of questions going to the panel sitting up here with me. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. And the panelists have only a limited amount of time to talk. So I ask all of the panelists to make sure you please do try your best to stick to the 5 or 6 minutes per question. So that's the challenge before us. My name is Graham Buckley. I'm the country director here for the ILO, covering Thailand, Cambodia and Lao PDR, and also in charge of our sub-regional office, the Decent Work Technical Team, covering East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And we do a lot of work on informality and addressing the informal economy. It's a big challenge for the reasons which I've just mapped out, but it's also a big challenge because of definitional issues. And I don't think we're going to get into this today, but I think obviously we have to recognize that informality is a rather nebulous, broad concept, and it's not a dichotomy between either in or out of the informality. A lot of work goes on in the grey zone. People sometimes are more or less informal in terms of their employment relationship than other times, and so on. But it's a big topic. It's a very important topic. Not just for the workplace, but also because the extent of informality, I think, has major implications for representation and the functioning of a democratic system for reasons which should be fairly evident. And I think we'll touch on those topics as we go on today. But in order to have this discussion, I'm very pleased to introduce to you the panel. We've got a panel of very distinguished speakers, starting on my right-hand side with Ms. Karina Trevila. She is from the Philippines, and she is the director of the Bureau of Workers with Special Concerns from the Department of Labour and Employment of the Philippines. To her right, I have Mr. Saeed Mohammed Fahimuddin Pasha, and he is a senior officer workers' rights at the ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation in Asia Pacific. And turning to my left, representing the employers on this panel, is Ms. Tran Thi Lan An, who comes from Vietnam, and she is the Secretary General of the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, VCCI. To her left, I have to get my left and right correct there, to her left is Ms. Sumi Dahanarajan, and she is the Associate Director of APAC Forum for the Future. And finally, at the end, is my colleague also working with the ILO. He is a Project Technical Officer to the project on building resilience for the future of work and the post-COVID-19 pandemic, based in ILO, Nepal, and his name is Mr. Shusuke Oyobe. So this is the panel. I've already, I think, exceeded my time limit for the introductions considerably, so I do apologize for that. So I'll quickly start off with the first question, which I'll pose to Karina on my right, and she will tell us a little bit about the experience in the Philippines. As some of you may know, the Philippines put in place a very comprehensive policy to ensure an inclusive economic recovery to the pandemic. And I would be grateful, Karina, if you could just elaborate on a little bit of the experience and how, in particular, the government of the Philippines addressed the needs of those own account workers in the informal economy and the measures taken to promote formalization. Over to you, Karina.
Thank you, Grimmy. Good morning to the distinguished panelists and participants. We express our appreciation to the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, and other partners for giving us the opportunity to share the National Employment Recovery Strategy, or NERS, which adopted a whole of society approach and mapped out a comprehensive plan to ensure an inclusive economic recovery, taking into consideration the changes in the labor market brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the fast adoption of the new technologies. So the plan on recovery focused on three things. One is creating an enabling policy that encourages job generation and improves access to employment, livelihood, and training. Second, improving employability, wellness, and productivity of workers, and taking advantage of the opportunities in the labor market under the new normal. And third is providing support to existing and emerging businesses to preserve and create employment, paying particular attention to micro, small, and medium enterprises. Chaired by the Department of Trade and Industry and co-chaired by both the Department of Labor and Employment and the National Economic Development Authority, the national plan was formulated following multi-stakeholder consultations and social dialogues with various government agencies, workers' unions and organizations, employers' organizations, and civil society groups. So the businesses and workers are at the very core of the whole of society approach to restart economic activities, restore business confidence, upgrade and retool the workforce, and facilitate labor market access in an enabling environment supported by good governance and infrastructure. So there is an 8-point employment recovery agenda, which features strategic action points, of which some are supportive to the key reform areas to promote enterprise formalization as prescribed by ILO Recommendation 204, such as the support of the passage for priority legislation and policies that strengthen economic and employment recovery, which is parallel with Recommendation 204 on promoting active employment policies and conducive business environments. There's an action point on extending assistance to establishments or enterprises, including micro-entrepreneurs and small-scale producers, through loans, deferment of applicable fees, and streamlining of credit facility processes, which are hinged on the R204 principle and ensuring access to financial services. Another action point is on the inclusion or the provision of social protection to vulnerable groups, which aim to mitigate the negative impact on the livelihoods of informal economy workers, which is a key principle of R204. Focus group discussions specific for the workers in the informal sector and in the informal economy, such as delivery riders in food delivery and career activities, were facilitated for the Job Summit 2021, which is a commitment under the recovery plan and organized with the ILO, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank to solicit views and insights from several worker organizations and stakeholders to understand the needs and challenges they are confronted with. So the consultation was helpful insofar as gathering inputs from partners to develop a more meaningful and targeted responses and interventions. So what were some of the outcomes of the recovery strategy? We noted a marked improvement in the employment rate from 82.3% in April 2020, at the height of the pandemic, to 94.8% in July 2020. However, Significant part of the total employed are self-employed and unpaid family workers, which are considered as workers in the informal sector. There was also a 7.7% increase of establishments that are operational in 2021 compared with the pre-pandemic level. Of the total establishments in 2021, more than 90% are in the micro and small enterprises. But according to the Department of Trade and Industry, the number of business names registered increased by 44% compared with the 2019 data. So as way forward, the current administration through the National Economic Development Authority is in the process of crafting the Philippine Development Plan 2023 to 2028 and soliciting inputs from forums with youth, private sectors, and planners. And we're looking forward to how the employment recovery strategy will be reconfigured based on the strategic thrusts and priorities of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. I'll now ask Pasha to make an intervention from the perspective of the ITUC, and he will draw on some of the experiences to illustrate how workers in the informal economy have been addressed by trade unions. It's a difficult sector of the economy sometimes to reach out to and to organize for obvious reasons, but I think that there are some successes, including during these difficult times of the pandemic. So Pasha, if I could ask you just to sort of map out some of the way forward from the perspective of the workers' organization. Thank you.
Good morning, friends. It is an honor to be here with such an esteemed panel. And thanks, Graham, for giving me such an important question. However, I don't know how I will justify this because it is a bit difficult to describe the pain and woes of workers in the informal economy affected by the pandemic. But let me make my attempt. Friends, you are aware that the informal economy employs more than 68% of the workforce in Asia Pacific. It is prevalent among the young population aged between 15 to 24, with 86.3% of young workers compared with 67.1% of adult workers in the region. Within the region, South Asian countries share the highest levels of informality. More than 80% of workers engage in informal activities in South Asia, and 90% of the businesses in that region are informal. These workers are excluded from the protection of labor laws and social protection schemes that apply to organized labor, and pandemic has further deteriorated their conditions. You know, many MSMEs were closed as they could not sustain themselves through the lockdown, leaving many informal sector workers unemployed. Economic losses accumulated due to reduced demand, restriction of movement, lack of access to markets, and loss of mobility of people and goods have all affected workers. Even though I have been given the responsibility for the Asia Pacific's informal economy, it is challenging to cover every country in the time available. I will give a couple nations as examples here. Let me begin with India. A rough estimate suggests that more than 90% of India's workforce is engaged in the informal economy. And this has absorbed most of the migrant workers. Millions of migrant workers and their families were impacted by the lockdown. Many of them were asked by their house owners to immediately vacate their rented premises or worksite where they lived. Many of them realized they would not be able to survive the lockdown in the destination region because they would be unable to manage their consumption expenditures without income from work. In the absence of transport, the migrant workers and their families, including women and children, had no further choice than to make their journey homewards on foot across distance of hundreds of kilometers, carrying all their belongings. Among them were also people with disabilities, pregnant women, and families with infants. The informal sector constitutes 85.1% of total employment in Bangladesh. The ready-made garment sector, RMG sector, which contributes almost 80% of country's export, was severely hit by the cancellation of orders worth 3.15 billion USD. And this resulted in massive layoffs. Around 2.2 million workers lost their jobs. A study carried out by HomeNet revealed that 60% of home-based workers in South Asia didn't receive any cash or food support from the government during the pandemic period. As a result, they have faced difficulties leading their lives and meeting their daily necessities. In order to survive, 82% of the workers withdraw their savings, sold their land assets, or mortgaged their homes, or took loans from relatives, neighbors, or microcredit organizations to meet their household expenses. No doubt, the government of countries in South and Southeast Asia responded to the crisis with relief measures and support. However, a large section of workers in the informal economy remained absent from these relief policies and programs offered by the governments. Civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and individual citizens, in addition to the government, lent assistance during the crisis. The pandemic also establishes that the roles of trade unions and labor rights organizations are crucial in a situation like this, and the government should involve workers and their representatives in designing and delivering social protection and ensuring appropriate safety nets for the workers. And yes, of course, this is in line with the ILO recommendation 204, which advocates the extension of social protection coverage to the workers in informal economy. Friends, however, we are saddened to see that some governments are promoting informality in the name of various schemes where workers are being hired on a contractual basis, denied social protection, social dialogue, and even minimum wages. Unfortunately, there are reverse attempts being made to informalize the formal sector, especially in health, education, and service sectors. We as trade unions are taking up these issues and making efforts to bring these workers into the formal economy. Just for example, there's a state in India called Jharkhand, where 77,000 workers, Anganwadi workers, midwives, were recruited under the Government of India scheme Integrated Child Development Services, ICDS. They were not covered under any social protection plan and didn't get even the minimum wage, despite they are being working for the Government of India scheme. On September 14th, the Jharkhand government took a historic decision and approved new recruitment honorarium guidelines for the state's 77,000 female employees. In one go, the honorarium is up by about 50%, the retirement age is raised to 62 years, and a social security benefit is introduced. This decision will not only benefit approximately 77,000 midwife workers in the state, but it will also inspire approximately 1.4 million Anganwadi women workers, midwives in other states to band together in order to obtain similar benefits. No doubt, ITUC affiliates, INTUC, Indian National Trade Union Congress, has played a vital role in bringing these workers into the formal economy. This is just an example. Other affiliates such as SEWA, Self-Employed Women Association, work extensively for women workers in the informal economy. We need to train our affiliates by providing them with technical support. Without a doubt, the ILO, especially ACTRAV, and other organizations are assisting us in this regard. Now, I think I already consumed my time, so I will stop here. Maybe if I will get time in the second round, I will highlight a few more success stories of the formalization of informal economy. Thank you, friends.
Thank you very much, Pasha. And I was pleased there that you made reference to something called a recommendation. As I'm sure that you know, the ILO is a tripartite organization made up of representatives of workers, employers, and government, and they come together periodically to put together international labor standards, which are made up largely of conventions and recommendations. And we have one particular recommendation which is concerned with the informal economy, and that's recommendation 204. And I'm going to turn to my colleague on my left, who represents the Employers Organization of Vietnam, and ask the question specifically about recommendation 204 and how that has helped to guide the work in Vietnam to support increasing formalization of the economy in Vietnam. So Lan An, over to you. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Moderator. And first of all, I'd like to say thanks to the organizer to give me the opportunity to be part of this very important panel discussion. And as you know, that Vietnam had been on a sustained economic growth for more than 6% for decades before the COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2021, the GDP growth of Vietnam was 2.58%, in the contrast of many of the rest countries in the world with the negative growth. And also Vietnam has set the goal of reaching the upper middle income status by 2030. And for this goal, the low levels of productivity, low levels of working conditions, and access to the social protections that characterized for informal employment need to be addressed. And today in Vietnam, more than 2/3, about 35 million of the workforce are in the formal employment. And this number has been reducing for the last many years. And moreover, the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemics, the digitalizations, and the climate change has been strengthened the stress for informal employment increase and formal employment reductions, and slow down the process of formalizations in Vietnam. And also, as you all know, by the nature of the situations of informal workers and entrepreneurs have a high degree of vulnerability. They are not clearly recognized under the law, and therefore they are limited access to the legal protection, excluded from the social protection system, and they need to rely on the voluntary system that is unaffordable for most. And informal workers tend to be paid less than formal workers and have no job security to access to other jobs related benefits. In Vietnam, for example, 43.9% of the formal workers belong to the vulnerable group. And among them, 97.9% of them have no security, social security. Only 0.2% of them have a compulsory social security, and 1.9% of them have voluntary social security. So the informal sectors is typically dominated by small, unproductive enterprises, which are often largely disconnected from the formal economy and show very little growth potential. Therefore, minimizing the vulnerability and risk faced by the informal sector, improving the productivities and social protections by formalization is a very big challenge for the Vietnam policymakers. So in Vietnam, for the last many years, together with the ILO, International Labour Organizations, we introduced a recommendation 204 that could help to contribute towards the aim of formalization in Vietnam. So first of all, the R204 set up the mindset and understanding about the informal economy under the form of 12 guiding principles on how to help the labor force transition from the informal to the formal economy. For example, for the employers, it can provide a level playing the field so that the business can compete fairly with one another. And for the workers, it assists them to claim their rights and escape from informality. And also from the governments, it offers the opportunity to regulate the unregulated economy and providing a revenue base for tax collection and social security benefits. And for us, R204 also provides the 3 objectives of an integrated approach. First of all, is the formalizations of enterprise. So registrations of economic units, increased compliance, extension in applications of labor and social security regulations. Second is the formalizations of jobs, extension of applications of labor regulation. extension of coverage of social security, and registrations of employment relationship and registrations of own account endeavors. And the third one, the productive job creation in the formal economy. Most new entrants have access to employment in the formal economy, increase formal employment intensity of growth, and prevent informalizations of formal jobs. So for us, for the employers, we can see that implementations of R204 is meaningful in promoting all those three objectives at the same time. For your information, Vietnam recently, we have very strong political will to address these issues of informality in the economic development that needs to be covered in the regulations system. And in this context, R204 is quite useful to contribute towards the aim of formalizations and prevent the informalization as well. And now we're working closely with the ILO, Vietnam, and different national stakeholders on this work, but it can't be done overnight, and it needs the long-term vision for formalizations in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've now heard from government, from workers, from representative of employers, and we're now going to hear, I'm going to turn to Sumi and ask for a perspective from civil society organizations, particularly the organization that she works for, and the particular question relates to how to promote decent working conditions and human rights among enterprises, businesses in the informal sector. A big question there. Over to you, Sumi.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you to the organizations and the ILO for having me here. It's a good question, because as we are, as the title suggests, we are looking to spur formalization, and we will be pushing for moving towards that. But for the here, that can take a very long time. And for the here and now, we need to be able to protect informal workers, informal sector workers. So, how do we go about it? And I'll speak from the perspective of an organization that has been engaging with businesses and companies. And I think I'd like to start by talking about what are some of the major challenges of promoting decent working conditions for the informal sector workers with businesses. And I'll point to 3 or 4 of them just to kind of give us a bit of a frame to have a discussion around. So the first one I want to talk about is how businesses' understanding of the lived experiences of informal sector workers can be quite limited. In a recent study that an organization called Pillar 2 and ourselves conducted, looking at the application of business and human rights norms to the informal economy, one of the key observations that we made from speaking to people who work very closely with informal sector workers is that informal sector workers experience a range of human rights challenges that are sometimes quite different from formal sector workers. I know that sounds like stating the obvious, but I think it's important to acknowledge that. And many of these challenges that informal sector workers face derive from intersectionalities. Their ethnicity, their gender, their caste, their religion, their migrant status, all make for a very complex interaction that informal sector workers have with the ability to have their human rights protected and to be able to provide social protection for them. These are complex, and it can be challenging to identify the implications and know how to prevent or remedy their human rights abuses appropriately. The second point, and this may be particular to multinationals, is that supply chain traceability when it comes to informal sector workers is tough. They are often hidden in long and complex supply chains, which leads me to my third point, which is one of the critical challenges we see for the protection of informal sector workers, is that there in our part of the world, is that there is a very strong compliance narrative amongst businesses in Southeast Asia, which is the area where I pay most attention to. And auditing tools and assessment indicators are not always fit for purpose for identifying human rights impacts upon informal sector workers or their communities. And yet these compliance approaches, further driven by mandatory human rights due diligence laws, modern slavery laws, all good, but they are driving a particular compliance response from businesses in this region because they're being asked to comply by those further up the value chain. Business and human rights norms, particularly captured by the UNGPs, may need to further evolve to ensure that companies are equipped with a better understanding of the relational and the power dynamics between informal sector workers and the range of actors that they interact with in the system. In Asia, I believe we have a double whammy in that the UNGPs have not yet been adapted for MSMEs and SMEs. And these are the enterprises that are likely to employ informal sector workers. Some of the challenges that I believe MSMEs and SMEs face are a few. Firstly, the compliance narrative, and I'll come back to that. The compliance narrative means that when they are asked by businesses further up the value chain to comply with human rights indicators, they not only then experience a price squeeze and a time squeeze, they also experience a sustainability squeeze. And although we've spoken for many, many years of having a shared burden around protecting working labor standards and human rights, that shared burden doesn't always play out. And that creates challenges. The second is that MSMEs and SMEs tend to be takers rather than makers of some of the solutions that are out there or tools that are out there to protect the human rights of informal sector workers. And when you are a taker rather than a maker, then you don't feel that sense of agency or ownership to be able to implement these tools or services in a way that will actually fit how you would go about understanding the nature of how informal sector workers are experiencing lack of protections. So challenges, how do we make them more makers of the current solutions to protect informal sector workers' rights? The third I should have mentioned earlier is around the power dynamics that they have with their buyers or retailers further up the chain, and how that can influence the kinds of actions that they would take to protect informal sector workers. And then finally, I think it's the exposure or their socialization. You know, what they hear about the need to protect informal sector workers is their need to comply, rather than, you know, there is a need, a moral need, a values-based need, a purpose-led need for protecting those workers. Which leads me to my concluding point for this question, which is that the transition from informalization towards formalization is a most complex of transition within a most complex of systems, involving actors that often hold the least power and agency within it. If our policy assumptions are correct, that formalization is a strong route to ensuring workers' rights are protected, we will need to ensure that this transition process, the transition from informality to formality, is itself paying heed to this complexity. And paying heed to that complexity means being able to ensure that the transition process is rights respecting, equitable, and inclusive. We need to be able to grapple with some of the assumptions that, you know, if we move to formality, when we get to formality, there will be respect for rights. It will be equitable and inclusive, but there is something missing when we don't look at the process that takes you from one form to the other. And I would say that that's where we need to pay some attention to. At present, as our study with Pillar 2 indicates, the transition interventions to achieve formalization do not always have these qualities of being rights respecting, equitable, and inclusive, because there are a range of players that are bringing recommendation 204 into play, right? And we need to be able to work with all those players, can lead to risks of unintended consequences. And some examples of that, and I'll stop here, are, using sanctions or like fines for street vendors. Or another quintessential example is in relation to women workers being pushed out of flexible working arrangements that can assist them in meeting care responsibilities. So we need to be able to address these in a much more systemic way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumi. Now, without further ado, I'll quickly pass on to Shisuke, who is based in Nepal, but he is managing a project funded by the government of Japan, which looks at building resilience for the future of work. It's very much about the informal economy, and it covers not only Nepal, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And if you could give us a little bit of an idea about what your project is doing and some of the successes that you've experienced so far. Thank you. Over to you, Shisuke.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So as Graham just mentioned, this project started with the funding support of the government of Japan. This project started in April 2021. It's currently implemented in 4 countries in South Asia, including Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And I'm managing the entire project based in Ailo, Nepal. And the primary purpose of this project is to reach out and extend support to the workers and economic units in the informal economy who are suffering under the impact of COVID-19, and try to promote their formalization by collaborating with the ILO constituents in each country, especially the workers' union and the employers' organization. And so far, we have implemented the joint project activities with the more than 10 project partners, and we targeted, for example, domestic workers, cleaning and sanitation workers, or women entrepreneurs, small business owners who typically engage with the informal economy. And through these joint activities, we are expecting to cover thousands of targeted beneficiaries in the informal economy until the project closes in this coming December 2022. And regarding how our project contribute to the employment formalization, we basically take 2 different approaches which are reflected in every project activity with each partner. And first is the policy and institutional level approach, where we support the constituents to address the gap and cause of informality, which exists in the legal and the regulatory framework, and try to advocate the necessary policy actions. In fact, there are many cases that informal workers not enjoying labor rights simply because the existing labor laws are not, covering or recognizing some specific type of workers, and do not clearly define their labor rights entitlement. And actually, in fact, one of the project countries that we are working with, still the domestic workers are still not formally protected or recognized by the national labor law. So to cope with this kind of issue, one of our action is to conduct a research activity together with partners, which is called a diagnosis of informality, to identify and analyze the gap or causes of informality existing in the legal and regulatory framework targeting various sectors. And the result of this diagnosis is widely disseminated to the stakeholders to produce the shared understanding for the necessary policy actions. And on top of that, we are also organizing a number of social dialogue workshops where the workers union that representing some informal workers can discuss the issues that the informal workers face and the causes of informality with the government and other stakeholders, and try to advocate for the necessary policy actions. And the second approach is the direct intervention to the informal workers. So usually many informal workers are very isolated, as you can imagine, and do not belong to any workers' unions too. And because of that, they typically lack the advocacy and representation. And also they don't have any opportunity of learning about the fundamental labor rights or some key concepts of formalization. So therefore, together with the project partners, we conduct community level organizing sessions where we invite many informal workers from urban and rural communities to give opportunity to organize themselves and associate with the workers' unions. And in parallel, a lot of capacity building workshops are also delivered for them to understand the key concepts for the formalization, such as the rights as workers, and the necessity of contract, minimum wage, and the ways and benefit in enrolling in the social security system. So in this way, we always try to conduct a project activity with an integrated approach of policy and institutional level intervention and the direct intervention. And finally, I'd like to share one of the successful experiences which we had from our project with the Domestic Workers Union in Pakistan, which we conduct in the state of Punjab. So in Punjab, actually, it is estimated that 7 million people are working as domestic workers, and their informality and vulnerability has been a long-standing problem. And in 2019, the state government established the Punjab Domestic Workers Act, which basically defined the labor rights and social security coverage for the domestic workers. However, partly due to the onset of COVID-19, the implementation law was delayed. And also in the meantime, DWU found that some of the conditions defined in the act was actually putting barriers to the domestic workers to enroll in the social security system. And one of the barriers to the social security system was the contribution rate that domestic workers had to pay for the social security system. And in fact, the act in 2019 that I mentioned initially mandated the domestic workers to pay 1,500 rupee per month for the social security contribution. And this 1,500 rupee, which is almost $5 to $6 I believe, may sound a meager amount, but for the domestic workers in Punjab, many of whom are still working under the level of minimum wage, which is less than 25,000 rupee. Actually, this 1,500 rupee is not a little amount, but rather big disincentives for them to enroll in the social security system. Therefore, in our project with the DWU, we organized 3 times of social dialogue sessions, inviting various stakeholders, including the social security institution from the state government, to discuss the implementation of the act and also amend some social security conditions. And as a result of the dialogue, it was officially agreed that the contribution rate is reduced to just 300 rupee. And this decision was already reflected in the new regulation for domestic workers called Domestic Workers Registration and Benefit Regulation, which was enforced in this July 2022. And moreover, in direct intervention aspect, the DW conducted 40 times of community organizing session under our project and newly registered 1,500 informal workers in their union network. So in this way, our project is trying to give the real impact in the employment formalization on the ground, collaborating with the social partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go now to the next round of questions and ask our panelists to be even briefer this time, as time is ticking on. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the concept of informality, the informal sector, as it was once called, was first identified in the academic literature, I think, about 50 years ago, with work that was done in Kenya, 1972. And we tend to talk about the topic ever since, I think, and the similar issues kind of come up. But in fact, the landscape has changed, and there are certain, if you like, new issues that are addressed in the context of the informal economy, which we'll try to touch on briefly in this next round of questions. New issues like, for example, the platform or digital economy, how is that affecting the formalization of work? Issues to do, for example, with the environment and particular the groups of people that are particularly adversely affected by informal work. But first, I would like to come back to Sumi and ask specifically about informality and informal workers in the context of how they are affected by climate change and environmental damage, and what role they can play and policy can play in addressing those challenges that we are facing ever more increasingly. So Sumi, over to you on this particular question.
Thank you, Graham. And I'm glad that this is part of our discussion today, because, you know, as we consider this transition from informality to formality, it will be really important that we are really mindful of some of these key landscape shifts, and in terms of our ability to create policy measures that are going to be agile and adaptive, because much of the future is unknowable. with the disruptions. We experienced that with the pandemic. There'll be future pandemics to come, and we will have to act very quickly, but also appropriately. So let me start. Let's look at let's look at informality in the context of climate breakdown. And I'll start by observing that the effects of climate change are already having and will continue to have profound impacts upon workers in the informal sector, many of whom hold ecosystem-dependent jobs in agriculture, fisheries, forestry, all sectors where there are clear needs for adaptation. An estimated 1.2 billion jobs are dependent upon ecosystem services currently. There's another group, so that's one group. There's another group of informal sector workers that are in sectors which are critical in the fight against climate breakdown. We see that in the waste management sector. That is, usually where we think of waste pickers play a really critical role at the moment in construction, in terms of looking at different ways to construct and build buildings that are greener, more sustainable. And a final group of informal sector workers for whom their sectors, albeit polluting right now, have always served to provide accessible and affordable services. So what do we do with these workers? For example, jeepney drivers in the Philippines. If we take away that particular service because it is polluting, because it has got an impact, what happens to the workers? But also what happens to the communities that they serve. So that's where you feel the rub of climate change and human rights coming up against one another. On the question of how formalization can be instrumental in tackling climate breakdown, it's important to look at this aspect because clearly there are opportunities there. A formal sector clearly does enable the ability to adopt better environmental practices because you are able to enhance your ability to innovate with materials, production processes, and such like, because it's probably easier to be able to train formal workers to adopt these innovations, and you're investing in them, for the long game. Also, poor environmental practices tend to exist when workers are in exploitable situations, as informal sector workers often are. For example, the use of pesticides that are toxic happens when workers have little or no power to be able to challenge their use. So, you're having it's a multivalent phenomenon that you're seeing here. At the same time, however, it is critical that as we transition to new technologies in order to address climate change, new ways of operating supply chains, nearshoring, friendshoring, or shifting to circularity, that we do not discount the role that informal sector workers can play in climate mitigation. The NGO Virgo has rightly pointed out that informal sector workers can leave a smaller footprint than some green technologies. And they compare the impacts upon emission reductions of waste picker recycling efforts versus incinerators and waste to energy technologies, finding that the former, the waste picker recycling efforts, actually reduces emissions by 25% more. So, not losing sight of this and their role in climate mitigation. The final point I make, because I know we're strapped for time, is that, obviously, looking at this in a systemic, multivalent perspective will lead us to the conclusion that we need to pay attention to the agency of informal sector workers far more acutely when we look at addressing climate breakdown. And in formulating the transition from informality to formality, the need to take a just transition approach does need to include our ability to build in the role and agency of informal sector workers rather than moving them from one sector to another, and ensuring that the agility and adaptive capacity is maintained. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to come back to Shisuke and ask a little bit more about the project. You're 2 years in now. Obviously, you face a lot of challenges. Can you tell us a little bit about those challenges, but more particularly, as a result of those challenges, how you've addressed them, and some of the lessons that you have learned so far in this project. So thank you. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So in the first question, I'll focus more on the employment formalization. So now I'd like to, discuss about the challenges that we tend to face in the enterprise formalization. So now we have 3 ongoing projects with employers organizations in Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which try to promote the enterprise formalization for entrepreneurs and small business owners. And even also in the enterprise formalization aspect, we have taken the same 2 approaches of policy and institutional level intervention and direct intervention. And at the institutional level, the challenges that we tend to see is that the requirements and procedures for the enterprise formalization, such as the business registration, license application, tends to be quite unclear and complex for enterprises. And this is often because the vague definition or multiplicity of relevant regulations or like distribution of responsibility within different levels of government. And if you take the example in Nepal, actually the country is now undergoing the implementation of federalism, and the various administrative authorities are now devolved from the federal government level to the local to provincial government. And the administration related to the enterprise formalization is also part of the devolution, not exceptionally. So for instance, the development of business registration system, license application now falls under the provincial and local government administration. However, what we have observed is that the procedures established within each provinces and also local government seems to be, quite differently, established. And there is no clear alignment among the, province and also between the, provinces. And on top of that, there are some old regulations established before the federalization, which is still valid to date, that basically mandates some business owners in some particular, company or, particular type of company or industry to directly register their business to the federal government agency in Kathmandu, wherever their business is located. So in this way, the business registration and license application a little bit looks to quite complex for the enterprises. And we also found that it is also difficult even for the federal government officers to actually have a clear overview of the nationwide situation of business registration. So to cope with this situation, our project in Nepal is now supporting the government to initiate the mapping study to take stock of how the business registration systems are structured at local, provincial, and federal government level, and provide policy recommendations for alignment and simplification among the constituents. For the business registration system. And another challenge actually lies at the side of the informal business owners, which is their lack of understanding of the necessity and benefits and procedures for formalizing their businesses. And for this, it is, of course, essential to provide opportunity for them to learn about the key concepts, requirements, procedures of enterprise formalization. However, it is really common that particular training or awareness creating tools for enterprise formalization is not available among the constituents. So for example, in Bangladesh, we are now working with the One SME Association, and we have decided to provide a business formalization training to 200 informal entrepreneurs. And with that as one of the project activity with that organization. However, that SME association did not have any training modules, which is dedicated to the enterprise formalization. So to solve the situation, we reached out to the ILO headquarter formalization team and decided to introduce the Formalize Your Business training, which is a brand new training package developed by the ILO headquarter to capacitate the informal enterprises to formalize their businesses. So, and we successfully conducted the training of trainers of this training package in August in Bangladesh. And now we have started the application of this module to that 200 informal entrepreneurs training. So from these experiences, I think, I believe it is essential to help policymakers to analyze the efficiency of the formalization system and evaluate it from the lenses or angles of the business owners. And also, it is very definitely, important that we involve, the employers' organization and other, of course, stakeholders. It is very important to involve them to instill the employer's perspective or business owner's perspective to the formalization system. And also the capacity building or awareness raising among the informal business owners on formalization is also very crucial. And it is recommended to be taken up by the constituents as one of the key action plans for enterprise formalization. And finally, for both of the initiative, I think ILO can definitely support the constituents for the actual implementation and can provide the technical and resource support to scale up this kind of intervention. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Time is ticking on, so I will move back to Lan An. And now I will ask a question specifically about supply chains and MSMEs. We've heard a bit about MSMEs. A number of the panelists have referred to micro, small and medium enterprises during their interventions. As we all know, we live in a world increasingly globalized. We're increasingly seeing the importance of supply chains, but it's also very evident that at the base of those supply chains, there are a lot of MSMEs where employment practices may be less than desirable, where informality is more likely to be found. And I would like to ask Lan An how an organization like VCCI, the Employers Organization in Vietnam, addresses this challenge. What can VCCI do to address the challenges of informality at the base of the many supply chains that typify the economy in Vietnam? So over to you, Lan An.
Thank you, Ram. So you know that in Vietnam, about more than 10 years ago, we set the goal for by 2020, Vietnam would have 1 million of companies, registered company. We had an ambition to transform for 5 million of household business and farmer enterprise into registered companies. But by now we have only about 900,000 companies. It means that we could never reach that number 1 million enterprise registered companies by 2020. But from that, we can learn some lessons that we can apply for the future. You know that VCCI is a representative organization for the business community and employers community in Vietnam. So what we can do is that we can, on one side, we can participate in policy development and also provide the direct services to support policy implementations to the employers. And to support formalizations, VCCI participating in the tripartite plus mechanism with the Ministry of Labor, trade unions, and all other related stakeholders to develop policy to promote the transformation, formalizations in Vietnam, to promote the shift away from informal sector towards the formal sector, in particular from agriculture to manufacturing and services sector, because you know that the very big proportions of informal sectors is in agriculture. And also we can see that from the last 10 years, we can see that the big challenges for the informal sectors enterprises to transform into the formal sectors because of cost of formalizations. It means the cost of taxes, labor protections policy, and it can be considered as the major causes to many informal business households. They refuse to become formal enterprises. And also another very important thing is that business registrations is also barriers for the companies because it's like take long time and very complicated process to register as a formal company. So the role of VCCI is to work to make it easier administrative procedures for the companies to be formal. And also one thing very important is that employers can also contribute to a reliable and accurate statistical database. That is very necessary for the policymakers to understand the complex characteristics of informalities and also monitor any progress toward the formalizations. And also, so through the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that the most vulnerable group of workers who are who had no skills or low skills. So I think that BCSI, we think that the skills development also is very important for in the process of transformation from the to the formalizations in Vietnam. Skilling, reskilling, and upskilling to make sure is very important for the workforce to make sure that they become more resilient with any challenges or changes that they may have in the future in the labor markets with the impacts of the COVID-19 or the climate change or digitalizations in the future. And employers organizations then also can participate, work together with the vocational training institutions, and also with the government to coordinate and matching to make sure that the skills for the workers can be improved. And also the employers organizations can work together with trade union and government to develop expanded and the multi-level inclusive social security systems to cover as much as possible workforce. To support the SME and MSME to develop in more green and sustainable manner and ensure the worker rights is provided. And also we now promoting the responsible business and worker rights in the whole supply chain to enterprises that can be more productive, competitive, and contribute better to socio-economic development countries. So here I also like to mention that for the supply chain, now BCSI also working with the IZ to promote the responsible business help us to provide the consulting for the business in the whole supply chain to comply with the due diligence. And also to promote, we're working with the Vision Zero Fund. It's an ILO project to promote the occupational safety and health, and also the social security for the workers, informal workers in the coffee supply chain. And also VCSI also participating in the DAG is a domestic advisory group implementing the EVFTA, Vietnam EU FTA, to make sure that we can advise and monitor the compliance of the whole supply chains with the EU countries. So that's some ideas from Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those ideas from Vietnam, from the perspective of the employers organization there. I would now like to turn to hear a little bit more about the Philippines and the experience from the Department of Labor and Employment in the Philippines. And I'll ask Karina also to build on that theme of the MSMEs and give us a few more insights into the work of the Department of Labor and Employment in addressing informality in the Philippines. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to talk about what we have done so far as addressing the issue of informality. I will also include what the other departments in the Philippines have contributed in so far as addressing the same. And so for the Department of Labor and Employment, we have specific programs and services to protect the rights and welfare of the vulnerable and marginalized workers, especially the workers in the informal sector. One is in Filipino, it's called Tulong Panghanap Buhay sa Ating Disadvantaged or Displaced Workers, or the TUPAD program. This is a safety net program that provides temporary wage employment to informal sector workers whose livelihoods were affected due to economic shocks and natural calamities. So it provides income relief to informal sector workers who are unlikely covered by Social Security to meet their daily needs in time of sudden loss of income. So our secretary directed the enhancement of this program, dubbed as TUPAD Plus. If my colleague from Vietnam made mention of the Tripartite Plus, we also have TUPAD Plus Training Co-Production in partnership with Technical Education and Skills Development Authority. And given that the program is very temporary, or it's a temporary nature of emergency employment, he instructed the piloting of a project on upskilling and reskilling of the beneficiaries who were recently affected by an earthquake in the northern part of the country. The upscaling, which will be useful for construction-related jobs such as masonry, plumbing, electrical wiring, and installation and carpentry, to prepare them towards wage employment, which is more sustainable and a longer-term solution, and at the same time, help rebuild the community affected by the earthquake. And other skills training towards the track on entrepreneurship are also provided for the beneficiaries of the program. The second program is the DOLE Integrated Livelihood Program, which is a grant for livelihood assistance in the form of working capital to informal sector workers, to small-scale producers, ambulant vendors, etc., to enable them to start or enhance a business or restore their lost livelihoods. So the beneficiaries are linked among other agencies like the Department of Trade and Industry for branding and marketing needs, or the Department of Science and Technology for the application of technologies to ensure sustainability. We also have what we call the Enterprise Productivity Improvement Program, or the Productivity Toolbox, which is a ladderized package of developmental assistance provided by the National Wages and Productivity Commission to MSMEs on productivity enhancement trainings to ensure that they transition to more viable and competitive enterprises and eventually comply with labor laws. Recently, the Commission has developed new training modules to assist MSMEs to cope with the challenge brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the opportunities from the new businesses and work arrangements. We also have registration of workers association to promote the right to self-organization. So register workers association for those outside the traditional employment relationship, such as the ambulant, intermittent workers, self-employed, and rural workers. Organizations, they are formed for mutual aid and protection for its members and for acquisition of legal identity. The regular mandate of DOLE is on labor inspection system to ensure compliance to general labor standards and occupational safety and health. And this is conducted through routine inspection, complaint inspection, and occupational safety and health investigation. Furthermore, other agencies also implement programs and services that contribute in facilitating the transitioning of informal MSMEs to the formal economy. And we've been talking all throughout about complicated processes. And so we made business entry reforms such as the Ease of Doing Business Act, which introduced significant reforms in simplifying business registration processes, particularly at the local or municipal levels. So we now have the single unified business application form, which unified past separate forms on local business licenses, clearances, permits, authorizations, and other usual requirements from the local government units. What is important about this Ease of Doing Business Act is that it standardized the deadlines, not only for the local government transaction, but all government agencies. So the process cycle time had been shortened. And in terms of access to production or so productive resources, skills development, technology, and business services, we have what we call the Village or Barangay Micro Business Enterprise Act, which integrated those in the informal sector with the mainstream economy. And for those micro business enterprises that will register, they are provided with incentives, among others, such as income tax exemption, priority to a special credit window set up specifically for the financing requirement of these micro enterprises. And we also have the business center under the Department of Trade and Industry. They are established in local government units to facilitate access of information, services and training, financing and marketing to MSMEs, including the informal sector operators, to support their growth and thereby create more job opportunities. Another one is the Shared Service Facilities program of the same department. It aims to improve MSMEs' competitiveness by providing machinery, equipment, tool systems, accessories, and other auxiliary items, skills and knowledge under a shared system. So the SSF is a public-private partnership initiative being implemented through cooperators who can house the machinery and equipment and make this accessible to MSMEs. Finally, we have access to inclusive finance. We have the National Strategy for financial inclusion under the Central Bank of the Philippines. And we also have the full system or the national ID system, which established a single national identification system for all citizens. So it will accelerate our transition to digital economy using this as an identity, a sole identity document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you very much. Now, for the final intervention from the panel, I turn to a topic which frankly could have occupied the whole session and more this morning. During COVID, we saw a huge expansion in the platform gig economy in many countries around the world. And a lot of this work is a new type of work, and a lot of it is either in the informal economy or is informalized to some extent. So I'd like to turn back to Pasha and ask specifically the question about, from the workers' perspective, how this group, ever-expanding number of workers, this new group of workers, how can their challenges and their work experience be improved and their interaction in the labour market be formalised? What can trade unions and workers' organisations in general play to support these group of workers?
Once again, thanks, Graham, for giving this question. And friends, to make sure that we are on the same page, I would like to give a brief overview of the kind of informal economy first. We could classify the informal economy in two ways. The first one is traditional forms of informal economy, which includes street vendors, domestic workers, home-based workers, rack pickers, and so on. And then there's a new forms of informal economy, which we call it gig or digital economy. Even in digital economy, we have two subcategories. One is web-based workers and second one is platform workers. So when we say web-based workers, it includes tasks or work assignment are performed online or remotely by workers. These tasks may include design and software development, carrying out translations, legal, financial, and patent service, etc. Then location-based platform are carried out in person in a specified physical location by workers and include taxi, delivery, and some home services, domestic work, and care provisions. So this is only for a kind of understanding what we understand from the concept informal workers and what kind of categories we have. So now we have few very classic examples, especially I would like to start from Australia. Australia, we have a classic example of food delivery workers who were facing two major problems. One, no voice or representations. They were not part of any union. They were not part of any social dialogue process. And the second, low pay and poor safety. The report says that it's a high-risk work because of the frequent road accidents. According to the data, 1 out of every 4 riders is involved in an accident. And the worst part is that 1 out of every 8 is seriously hurt or injured. Riders are being killed routinely here. The pandemic has also increased the plight of these workers and revealed the fractures in the social security system. Considering these issues, the Transport Workers Union of Australia, TWU, has mobilized food workers and demanded that regulating agency ask Deliveroo, the major food delivery service company, to accept the TWU health and safety plan. And it has been accepted. A major win for the delivery riders of Australia, and it will help to protect the lives of food workers there. Second examples we have from Indonesia. In Indonesia, the proportion of informal employment amounts to 83.5% of total employment. Efforts are made to organize online drivers, Grab and Gojek. Like other informal workers, they are also facing more or less the same challenges, such as a flexible form of employment. That means no written contract, no social protection, and being deprived of freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. The ITUC AP affiliates KSPI as a national center and SPMI as a regional center have set aside funds for the organization of online drivers. We can see some good results are coming as the campaign is getting good support from the public and transport laws are being reviewed in Indonesia. It has helped unions to bring a significant number of online drivers into the trade union fold. Then Singapore. We could also see good progress in Singapore too for freelancer workers, especially for food delivery riders, private tuition teachers, wedding photographers, and taxi drivers. Now they are covered under the Trade Union Act. They can also join unions and engage in collective bargaining, which was not the case earlier. And thanks to Singapore National Trade Union Congress, which is an affiliate to ITUC. So friends, we can summarize it in a way that workers in the informal economy should be covered under the labor laws. They should get social security benefits. They should be allowed to participate in union activities and collective bargaining, and they should improve their health and safety standards. We need to look at the ILO guiding principles of recommendation 204, transition from the informal to the formal economy, and I'm very glad to see that major stakeholders are on the same page. Karina, who is representing the government, Tran, who is representing businesses, and me as a union representative highlighted the importance of ILO recommendation 204, and Graham has already further elaborated it. I will not repeat its principles again, but just reaffirm our commitment to its implementation. We know that we have not completely recovered from one of the most devastating pandemics. ITUC, Asia Pacific, from where I belong to, is making 5 demands for recovery and resilience, as well as a new social contract that is especially important for workers in the informal economy. The first, the creation of climate-friendly jobs. Sumi has already spoken about addressing the climate change. Second, workers' rights, including the rights to organize and occupational health and safety. Third, social protection, a major component of the ILO guiding principles of recommendation of 204. Fourth, equality. We also need to see workers in the informal economy from the gender lens too. And the fifth, the last one, is inclusion. Inclusion of workers from the new emerging informal sector, such as the digital economy, should be included as well. I do believe that together we can make some remarkable changes. And once again, thanks a lot for listening us patiently. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pasha. I'm conscious that we have eaten a little bit into our lunchtime, so I will not elaborate too much or even attempt to begin to try to provide a summary to the very rich and diverse discussion that we have had this morning. Thank you to all of the participants. There are or were over 80 people listening in online, as well as all of you here present in the room today. I thank all of the panelists for their interventions. There's been a lot of ground covered. I mean, this is a massive topic, of course, and I think we could spend a huge amount of time discussing this topic. Unfortunately, we haven't had an opportunity to have questions from the floor, but I'm sure the panelists would not mind answering a few questions once we close the session, if any of you have burning issues that you want to raise with them, notwithstanding the pressures of lunchtime, of course. So without further ado, I would say that I thank all of you once again. I thank the organizers for putting together this session. And I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you to everyone, and goodbye.